throughout the programme. Ed Vaizey, former Arts Minister, stayed in the same job, I think, for 5 years. 6 years, which is unheard of in politics. Did a very good job, I think. Natasha Devon hasn't quite been in her position on LBC for 6 years yet, but I'm sure she will be. Jonathan Reynolds is Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary. He won't want to stay in that job for 6 years, I'm sure. He's also Labour MP for Stalybridge and Hyde. And Ben Habib joins us. Welcome back to you, Ben, businessman and former Brexit Party MEP. So the number to call if you want to ask our panel a question is 0345 6060 973. You can watch us on Global Player on the LBC website at lbc.co.uk and the LBC YouTube and Twitter feeds.
0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's crack on with our first question. It's from Anthony in Staines. Hi, Anthony.
Hi, Ian. Hi, everyone. After today's shambolic performance by Boris Johnson, does he need to eat humble pie and invite Dominic Cummings back to number 10?
Well, that's an interesting thought, isn't it? But the theme of that question, though, is quite interesting, isn't it, Ed Vaizey? Because he doesn't seem to have people around him, either in the cabinet or indeed among his advisors, who can get a grip of him.
Well, I'm not sure. I think, I'm not going to deny that certain things have not gone to plan. They've been suboptimal, as they say. But you can have a run of bad luck. I mean, I was asked on a radio station, would I have voted on the Owen Paterson motion? And I said, I have to hold up my hands. I might have done, because there was so much pitch rolling beforehand about how badly Owen Paterson had been treated. It could have been a kind of mistake to make. But you're right. I mean, there's a certain element of you want safe and steady hands. It's a bit of a cliche. It's not actually Dominic Cummings. It's Eddie Lister, who famously ran his office, who's departed, obviously, he's gone to Thousand Laws, but he's left Downing Street. And actually before that, you knew him well, Ian, when he was mayor, famous guy, Simon Milton, who was head of Westminster Council. And one of the things that made Boris such an effective mayor was that he had good people as his deputy mayors running the things that mattered to Londoners. And I think that we can all play a parlour game about who should be in Downing Street and who should be in the cabinet. But I think it's becoming a narrative, and we need to see an element of grip going forward.
Johnny?
Look, I don't think any advisors will make a difference if you have a Prime Minister who's not taking the job seriously. And I think the Boris performance has been very successful for him for a long time, but it does feel... I was just thinking on the way over here, and this comes down to him as Prime Minister, about where we're at with the broken promises. I mean, you have the 40 new hospitals, you have HS2 now, you have the triple lock suspended for a year, you have Northern Powerhouse Rail, you've got this bridge to Ireland. I'm not sure whether that was a promise, but it may have been an aspiration. You can list them, and that comes down to him. And I think he's run out of road. I don't think it's that funny anymore. That was a disgrace, that performance today. You cannot turn up at a serious audience with that level of preparation. And I speak as somebody who's been to Peppa Pig World and have quite a lot of time for it. I've been several times, but the speech didn't work on me.
Several times? Are you mad? And you seriously aspire to government, and you admit that you've been to Peppa Pig World?
I could tell you about most of the children's theme parks of the UK, but still, no, I just...
Did you buy a Lego Fast Pass? These are the unanswered questions.
That would be a two-tier system, Ed. Socialists obviously would queue like everybody else, like we do as a family, but it's just not good enough. There are some serious problems facing this country in terms of, a business audience. You talk about inflation, you talk about the cost of living, the problems in Northern Ireland, the post-Brexit readjustment, labour shortages. That wasn't someone who prepared seriously for that audience he was performing at today.
Natasha Devon, you're a renowned fan of Boris Johnson.
I mean, it's really interesting listening to the commentary about the speech as I was coming in today, because there's two different things going on, aren't there? There's the big pause, which I think is absolutely forgivable. We've all had that moment where we go into fight or flight, we panic, and when you're in front of that many people, you have all that scrutiny. That, to me, was very forgivable. The stuff where he was making jokes that weren't funny and just going and making noises, that's standard Boris Johnson. To me, he hasn't changed. I think people's perception of him has changed. The context around it, I mean, maybe, Anthony and Staines, you're right, maybe it is the lack of Dominic Cummings to provide some pithy 3-line slogans for him that was missing today. But it feels to me like the rest of the world is catching up to where I've always been on Boris, really.
Ben?
Well, I think the reality of Boris is now catching up with him. He is a man who puts political expediency ahead of everything, as far as I can see. The manifesto pledges made by the Conservative Party have been observed largely in the breach. A month and a half ago, national insurance was put up, an absolute must, we were told by Rishi Sunak, in order to balance the books. And then a month later, when he announced the budget, he found another £150 billion to spend, having raised £12 billion a year through national insurance. So this is a government that doesn't have a plan, makes promises it can't keep, has little vision of where it wants to take the United Kingdom. And actually, to the extent that it executes anything, it executes it extremely badly. The one thing he's got right, which he's attributed, which is attributed to the Prime Minister, is the vaccination programme. But actually, that's more to do with Oxford University and AstraZeneca than it is to do with the prime ministerial oversight of our COVID policies. And, if you want to talk about COVID, the idiocy of 9/10 of the policies that came out of government over COVID and continue to come out of government.
But how can you slag him off for that part and say, well, that's all down to him, and then when something goes right, you say, oh, it's got nothing to do with
government policy and the creation of the vaccination are two different things. The creation of the vaccination...
The government provided the funding and the circumstances to allow the vaccine to be developed, didn't it, in contrast to some other countries?
Yeah, and, OK...
So that was
fair point, Ian, fair point. But there are lots of other governments that provided funding and failed to come up with a solution. So there is a lot to be said for Oxford University's contribution to it as well. But the one thing he did get right was the vaccination programme. And, we didn't take economic advantage of it. We were quite slack in the way we opened up the economy. And then when we did open up...
But again, that the IMF say that our economic growth over the next 12 months and indeed the following year is going to be bigger than any other G7 country.
That's because we had one of the biggest economic setbacks.
Well, they must be doing something right.
We had one of the biggest.
He didn't mention this in his speech and talked about Peppa Pig instead in front of 190,000 businesses.
It's a fair point.
I've got to say, can I say, just as the former culture minister, that I strongly defend Boris talking about Peppa Pig. I used to say all the time with David Cameron.
Is that culture?
Well, let me explain.
Okay.
I always used to say to David Cameron, I want to see you on the set of James Bond just as much as I want to see you in the proverbial widget factory, because the entertainment industry in this country is one of the most successful in the world. It generates hundreds and millions of jobs and billions of pounds in both exports and inward investment. Peppa Pig is a fantastic, successful British IP. So I do not hold Boris accountable. I may say his speech could have been delivered better, but to talk about Peppa Pig to the CBI, I think that is a masterstroke. And if I'd been in Downing Street, I would have backed him all the way.
But do you think Eddie let it down by doing it in that way? I can see the point you're making. This is an important sector for the UK. This is a strength of ours. I think he's cheapened it by not preparing that point properly.
Well, I think, one of the themes is that Boris does deliver speeches in a certain way and with a certain tone. So you could say, potentially, the CBI... Another kind of, obviously, defence of the speech and, indeed, of Peppa Pig and Peppa Pig's importance to our economy is that we are still talking about this speech 12 hours later. When did you last discuss Prime Minister's speech to the CBI?
Not in a good way.
Well, some people say all news is good news.
It is a fair point, though, in that we haven't talked anything about Keir Starmer's speech, have we, Johnny?
Well, if Keir had done worse than the Prime Minister today, I think I might not have turned up. I mean, that's, the idea that all news is good news when it comes to politics. Look, we're very happy with how it went today. That's an important audience for us in terms of coming back from the 2019 defeat. Got to acknowledge what we got wrong and move on from that, and we think it did that. And certainly the feedback I've genuinely had from a lot of people at that conference is they know who they'd prefer, and it's not the Prime Minister.
Boris, of course, famously doesn't like the CBI, does he? So that might have been...
No, didn't it? It was them that his business remark was
subtext might have been,
at, wasn't it?
This is what I really think of you.
Well, at least he's fleshed out that policy a little bit today.
Right, Anthony, thank you very much. Let's move on to Sarah in Welwyn Garden City. Hello, Sarah.
Hello, Ian. Lovely to speak to you again.
Hi.
And hello, panel. The question I have for all of you is, have you any idea how universal credit works? I'm a disabled person, and I just wondered if any of the panel actually know how it works.
Johnny Reynolds. Sarah, thanks for your question. Johnny Reynolds, I would hope that you do know how it works, given that you are Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary.
Yes, I feel I just want to say that's not someone I know ringing in to try and give me an easy question at the beginning. I mean, the answer to Sarah's question is it's a household means-tested benefit. If your income, your family household income, is at a certain level, and depending on your other circumstances, children, whether you're a renter, you'll receive top-ups for it. And I don't think anyone objects to that combined nature of the benefit, that the old system was creaking. But I think what would be particularly important to say to Sarah is, I understand, Sarah, that for a lot of disabled people, the system doesn't replicate parts of the older system, and so a lot of disabled people are worse off when they move on to universal credit, hence they stay on the legacy benefits part of it. Those people didn't get the uplift, the £20 uplift that the universal credit core amount did at the start of the pandemic, and that is grossly unfair. There's a court case now taking place about the discrimination involved in that. But there is, I think, more to say in terms of like the automated nature of universal credit is the bit that worked well in the pandemic. That kind of investment in technology and evolution of tax credits, that bit was good, but there are still major design flaws. The treatment of disabled people is part of it. The 5-week wait is a major driver of food bank need, because you could get support to people a lot quicker. Childcare is a huge issue, because you will have to pay your childcare up front if you access childcare, whereas universal credit is paid in arrears. And most of all, deductions. I mean, there are people currently losing £200, £300 a month from what is not a generous benefit to begin with, and so they're permanently in debt. And the system should stabilise people's lives, give them a little bit of assistance when they need it. Most people are on benefits for actually a short period of time, less than 6 months. Actually, what you find with too many people in universal credit, it's making their lives more complicated, more hectic, it's causing them more problems. And I do think the government need to acknowledge that. There's a lot of people, not just Labour people, the House of Lords Economic Committee, which is chaired by Lord Forsyth, did an excellent report into it. I just want them to listen a little bit more to some of the problems, and I think we could solve them if they did that.
Well, Sarah, I think we can agree that Johnny does know how it works. Ben?
I didn't know how it worked until Johnny just explained it, but thank you. From what I've read, it's complex, difficult to understand, and Johnny's just confirmed that. And actually, that's the beginning and the end of my understanding of universal credit, to be utterly frank.
Isn't that part of the problem, though, that people at the sort of higher end of the income scale, and particularly people who are in business, it's because it doesn't come across their radar very often, they don't understand how important it is for people at the bottom of the income scale?
Well, I think what we in business do understand is the need for levelling up. And I mean, the benefit system is a social safety net. It's not the means by which you get the country moving forward. What I think business understands very well is the imperative of levelling up, actually, for the United Kingdom. And what I do also understand is that you do not level up the country through a green industrial revolution, which hits the poorest I'm digressing, but the business approach would be one to solve the inequities across the country and to get the economy generally moving forward. The social safety net is not something that's going to trouble businessmen mostly, because they're already dealing with the employed as opposed to the unemployed. So it is something that isn't really, as you say, Ian, going to come across businessmen's radar.
I can sense, Natasha, that you're chomping at the bit.
Well, Sarah, I don't know if you're a listener to my show, but if you are, you'll know my brother has a long-term physical invisible disability called Behçet syndrome, and I've been with him as he's tried to claim universal credit. So what I can tell you, that while we might understand how it's supposed to work in theory, when somebody has a disability that is rare, that doesn't fit the criteria, that you can't rubber stamp and tick in certain boxes, it's incredibly difficult. And that my brother, like so many millions of others throughout the country who find themselves in this situation, was treated as though he was trying to scam the system, had his dignity taken away from him. And I don't think it does work. I think that's the problem.
So you kind of know how it doesn't work as opposed to it. But as John said, in the pandemic, it did, because I think everybody expected it to collapse in the pandemic, and it was absolutely not the case. And after the initial few weeks, when there was what was it, 2 million people applying almost at once.
There was, but
it
it's
actually
important to
did
say
stand up
that was
to
not the standard
scrutiny.
product. So sanctions were suspended, identity checks were suspended. It was an expedited system in the pandemic.
Ed?
Well, I mean, it's a bit of fascinating discussion, and you're right, Johnny does know how universal credit works, and I thought his exposition covering kind of all the issues was incredibly impressive. And benefits are incredibly difficult to make work in practice, if I can put it that way. And I think that what Natasha was saying is a good example of that. When I first became an MP in 2005, the tax credit system, which again actually had sort of in principle broad cross-party support because it was about supporting people in work. It's a lot of the benefit system since the 80s has been geared towards making it so that people can move into work without going into this cliff edge where you suddenly lose your benefits. So it gives people an incentive to want to work because they know they're not going to lose their benefits. But the tax credit system was not working in practice. As an MP, that was my main casework in quite an affluent constituency. Universal credit was meant to solve some problems that you applied for lots of different benefits, but in practice it has had its problems. I do think it's very interesting, and it's a credit to what is called the Government Digital Service, that the universal credit system worked so well during the pandemic. It's a lot of hard work has gone into making government services work digitally, so that is a big step forward. But we kick around ideas like a universal basic income and so on. I don't think they will probably work, but we need to kind of focus on this principle that people should be secure in knowing that they have a safety net. They shouldn't have to go jump through too many hoops. And they should be able to go into work and get work without falling off this cliff edge where they suddenly lose their benefits. But making that work in practice for millions of people is a hell of a lot easier to say than do.
All of the texts and tweets that are coming in are about Peppa Pig. Sarah, thank you very much indeed for your question. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put your question to our panel. And you can text it if you like, 84850. I know not everyone can ring in at this time of day. 17 minutes past 8.
LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
8:20. Let me reintroduce my panel to you. Ed Vaizey is here, Natasha Devon, Jonathan Reynolds and Ben Habib. They're taking your questions right up until 9 o'clock, 0345 6060973, or you can text your question on 84850. And that's what Debbie in Walton has done. She asks, why should anyone have to sell their own home to pay for care? I would turn that question around and say, why not, Natasha Devon?
Well, I think it's less about that and more about the inequality between people who have a home that is worth a lot of money or have a lot of assets and people who don't. It's about the proportion of their assets that they would have to sell. Originally, it was promised, wasn't it, that nobody would have to pay more than $86,000. That was promised as recently as September. Now they seem to have U-turned on that, although they are voting on that at the moment. And £86,000 to some people is 2% of their overall assets, and to other people it's all of it. So those people's family, children are going to be left a legacy, and others are not, and that's just going to lead to deepening inequality. We've already seen a deepening of the divide between the haves and the have-nots in this country over the past 10 years, and this is just more fuel on that fire.
But if we go from the point of view that the taxpayer is never going to be able to meet all of the social care costs, or maybe you think that the taxpayer should, and that's been an argument I was hearing on Sheila's programme today, that, well, why don't we treat social care exactly the same as we do the NHS? But if it is all about the kid's ability to inherit their parents' property, I mean, that isn't a way to fashion a policy, is it?
I hear what you're saying. I'm never one of those people that thinks about, if I do consider my parents dying, I think about what I will miss, not what I will gain. But I know not everybody's like that. So I think, your money is there for your life and your comfort. But having said that, I don't see why social care and healthcare are treated so differently, because they amount to the same thing, don't they? And if you get cancer in your old age, your care is provided for free. If you get dementia, it's not. Again, that seems epically unfair to me.
That is true, and we should also make clear that social care is not just care for older people, it's disabled people as well, often children. Ben?
Well, I take the view that people should take responsibility for themselves, and that relying on the state, particularly if you have assets, is relying on the state in order to protect your assets, to pass them on to the next generation, when you are able to fund your own care, isn't right. It doesn't ring true with me. In fact, I would go further and say the NHS needs reform. I think the way you fund the NHS needs reform itself. Why shouldn't the NHS be means tested? That may be an easier thing to say than to implement in reality, but I think people should take responsibility for themselves. If they can afford to pay, they should pay, and to the extent that they're able, they should pick up their own tab.
Does that count for healthcare as well?
Yeah, it does. I think the NHS needs reform. The narrative with the NHS, I know we're stepping away from the question again, but the narrative with the NHS has become one of, is anyone actually allowed to get ill? Is anyone actually allowed to die? And anything short of the protection of life in perpetuity is a sort of failure. And we need to turn that on its head, and we need to have a realistic discussion about the subject.
Isn't part of the problem, Ed, and although I said that there are other people involved in social care, not just older people, but the fact of the matter is we're all living for a lot longer. I was listening to somebody talking to Sheila on LBC earlier, who actually said, this is a failure of government policy because we're all living longer. I'm thinking, hang on a minute, I can see why you're saying, well, we're all living longer, so there's more need, but actually that is a success of health policy, isn't it?
Yeah, we could bang on about this in all sorts of different directions. It's interesting. I was talking to an American friend of mine today who said that they'd given a friend of theirs a job. The guy was between jobs. He was a very high-earning individual. He'd left one job and he was still looking for another one. He gave him a temporary job at much lower pay because the guy was desperate to ensure he had continued health cover. And we forget how lucky we are in the UK compared to if you go to the US. But I do agree with Ben. I think that we do not have anything like an intelligent discussion about how we can reform and change the NHS. There's no competition within the NHS. Even if you stick to the principle that care should be free at the point of use, you can still have competition. There's this terrible slogan that the Tories in particular have to put up with, which is you're privatising the NHS. What does that mean? You know, the virus that the vaccine that we've all benefited from was created by a private company. The people demonstrate say, I'm not taking a privatised vaccine. I mean, the level of debate about how we reform healthcare is so wrong. But having said that, social care, of course, is the orphan of our NHS, because we've never included social care, partly because, Iain, exactly as you say, when the NHS was created, most of us were dead by the age of 60. Social care just wasn't an issue when you created the NHS, and that's why it's been the orphan, and that's why we need, you know, the government's proposals. Even the guy who came up with the original blueprint and said they're a step forward. There'll be a row about them, but at last it's becoming seen as part of the kind of overall health care strategy in this country.
Johnny?
Well, I completely agree with your points about longevity, because I get this in the pensions debate, and you hear people saying, how are we going to pay for this? Everyone's living longer. I mean, it's fabulous. It's fabulous that is the challenge. That's the success of the health service, but also access to education, economic growth, better health and safety. So this should be seen, it's not a good thing, but you know what I'm saying, it's a good thing that people are living longer, and now we've got to confront it. To answer Debbie's question, the scale of the challenge means that some people are going to have to make some sort of contribution. In the government's manifesto, they were promised they wouldn't have to sell their own home. That's literally what it said. The problem with the proposals tonight, so you have this cap, which is set at £86,000. But the other side of that is a means test, which becomes more generous by expanding that means test to people with assets below £100,000. What we didn't know until last week is that if you qualify under that means test for support, the money you receive for that, because that's just care costs, it's not your accommodation costs in a care home, but the money you receive from the state won't go towards that cap. Now, that sounds quite complicated, but it basically means, as Natasha said, if you've got £1 million house, you're probably going to be able to pay that £86,000 and then pass on the rest of the value to your family. If you're in a house in a constituency like mine, you're never going to reach, or it'll take you much longer to reach that cap. So to pay for your contribution, you're going to lose the full value of your home. Say it's worth £100,000. Now, that isn't fair. That's people paying higher taxes, on working people paying higher taxes in terms of that national insurance increase to protect people who are more affluent with bigger homes, and there'll be a huge regional variation in that as well. So I think it's not what was promised, and that's crucial. And I think when you look at the overall social care package put forward by the government, higher taxes on working people, the money doesn't go to social care, it goes to the NHS.
Am I not right in thinking that in Scotland they have introduced a system where social care is funded by the taxpayer?
I think they have personal care. It's not the full system.
What's the difference?
That's care for people,
care in the home.
I believe, in the home, rather than what we're talking about here. The other point, of course, of the cap is that it's designed to produce an insurance market. So if you know no one will have catastrophic care costs, you should be able to create an insurance market. But that is uncertain as well. I mean, it doesn't really exist effectively like that anywhere in the world.
I mean, what you're effectively saying is that there is no solution to this. It's all very complicated, and let's move on to something else.
I think there is a solution that balances these difficult things, but at the minute, you look at the outcomes of what's being proposed tonight. That's why I'm going to vote against it after I finish on this programme, because I just don't think it's fair across the country, and it's not what was promised.
We have had a call from the Tory whips to hold you hostage here. By the way,
I've promised Jonathan to throw myself in front of the door to prevent you leaving.
I'm not sure I'll be the deciding vote with an 80 majority, but
But surely Ben has got a point here, Natasha, hasn't it? Surely the insurance market is the solution here, that we should all be insuring ourselves for this.
I think that's a very slippery slope. I mean, I can see the logic in saying if you can afford to pay for your social care, afford to pay for your health care, why be a burden on the state? But then I think the definition of who can afford is a very fluid thing, who deserves health care as well. So we have these arguments about things like obesity and smoking and lifestyle factors. You end up where nobody can rely on the state. And if you look at, for example, when you go to the US, you see homeless people on the street. They look like pigeons sometimes, with legs hanging off, because they cannot afford to get insurance to pay for their healthcare. I don't want to live in a society like that. I think it being free at the point of access, what we have, the NHS, is the best model, and that's why it's the envy of the world.
Text from Cliff in Wilton. Does anyone on the panel know if I can get a decent bacon sandwich at Peppa Pig World? Many thanks.
No, but you can at Greg's at Westminster Tube Station.
That's very useful information. Thank you very much indeed for that. 0345 6060 973 84850 on the text if you have more Peppa Pig comments.
I've just got the joke. I've just got the joke.
Have you?
Okay. Sorry,
I'm
really slow.
It's your age, isn't it? It's already happened to me. 8:30 on LBC News Headlines with Zora Suleiman.
Police in the US state of Wisconsin say a suspect held after a car was driven into a Christmas parade, killing 5 people, is to be charged with murder. 48 people were also injured, including a number of children. President Joe Biden has called it a horrific act of violence. MPs have started to debate the government's reforms to England's social care system. Labour says an amendment published last week about plans to exclude council support payments from the £86,000 cap on care costs will unfairly hit the less well-off. They're due to vote on the changes later tonight. And Bulb has become the latest energy supplier to run into trouble. It's being placed in special administration, but they're still allowed to operate as normal for now. LBC weather: light showers for Scotland, Northern Ireland and western coasts through the night, a low of 3 degrees.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:34. Paul in Bedford says, I'd like to see Ed Vaizey as Prime Minister. Sounds like a switched-on guy, unlike the clown we have now. Well, there's no accounting for taste, is there? Ed Vaizey is with us, Natasha Devon, Jonathan Reynolds and Ben Habib. They're all taking your calls, 0345 6060 973. Text question from Mike in Portsmouth. The Brit Awards are apparently no longer going to have male and female categories. Is this further evidence that the woke left are winning, Ben Habib?
Well, that decategorisation, if that's the right word to use it, is probably appropriate. I can't see why you should have a specific award for women and a specific award for men if they're competing on the same grounds. But, clearly women can't play rugby against men, in my book.
But
they could. They'd be annihilated.
Actually quite fun to watch, wouldn't it?
And, I think the day that they force women to intermingle with men in the same team, playing rugby, playing physical sports, where clearly the different physicality of the sexes comes into play, that, I think, will be the ultimate in wokery, having defeated common sense. But actually, that kind of makes sense to me for the decategorisation, sexual decategorisation of Brit Awards.
So what do you make of this whole thing about the woke left?
Well, I've never really understood what woke means. I think I know what it means, but everyone has a slightly different view. The way I see woke is the championing of... The definition for me of woke is the championing of minority rights at the exclusion of everything else. So it's sort of inverse of democracy. It's the inverse of the majority, what's good for the majority. So, you'll champion minority ethnicities, you will champion minority sexual orientation, you will champion anything other than what the majority may wish to support, including damaging and damaging and calling into question British history. People we might hitherto have regarded as our heroes, so the majority still regard as their heroes. That's how I see woke.
Okay, Natasha.
As we sit here in this studio under a socialist government in which all racial and sexual inequality has been completely eradicated under Prime Minister Corbyn, I cannot help but reflect on how the woke left have won, Iain. First of all, I would like Mike in Portsmouth to define what woke means, because the definition is, it comes from African American slang. It means to be awake to injustices in society, particularly racism. It has been co-opted, I think, over here in Britain. It has become what was once political correctness. And when people say, oh, that's woke, what they mean is, I used to be at the centre of the zeitgeist and now my generation is becoming irrelevant, and that frightens me, so I'm going to have a tantrum. So if that's what you mean by the woke left winning, then maybe they are, Mike in Portsmouth.
What do you think about the Brits?
I think, again, it makes sense. The only slight hesitation I would have is that some people seem to think that it will mean that fewer women will win in the category. However, when you look
Adele will always win.
Adele will win every year. But also, when you look at the album category...
Dodgy new album.
I haven't actually listened to it yet. I'm ashamed to say I've been doing other things. But if you look at the album category, which is, of course, gender neutral, over the past 19 years, you've had 9 men and 10 women win it. So based on that, I don't think that we need to worry.
Okay. Johnny?
I say this with all politeness, Mike, but stop being a snowflake. I mean, I honestly, I've learned more about woke from Natasha's description. I remember hearing, I think it was Jake Burry, Conservative MP, describe working from home in the pandemic as walking from home. And I thought that has lost all meaning. And just please stop talking, because you're not adding anything to it. I feel, Mike, the Brit Awards and the nation's going to survive this. That's my instinct on it. I think, if the album can be gender neutral, the world won't fall apart. I can say, someone on the left, I don't feel we've won very much over the last decade, so maybe Mike's attributing more success to us from that. But look, there are real problems to fixate on in this country. I don't think it's the Brit Awards changing their categories.
Well, Ed, you must have been to the Brit Awards virtually every year for the last decade.
I was the Minister for the Brits, and a jolly good night out it is too, I can tell you, except I missed Adele's breakthrough performance. I was voting, and I missed it. And obviously I can't even remember what I was voting on now, but I wish I had just ignored the whip and gone down and seen this incredible performance. And the Brits are fantastic, and I'm a bit suspicious of how Natasha knows these statistics about how many women have won these Brit Awards. But
I did some research before I came in, Ed. Recommend it, by the way.
But I was told that these So Mike
Boris
from
would never bother with that.
Portsmouth. So Mike in Portsmouth is basically Natasha's stooge. Because I was told we just responded to topics as they came in, and she knew that someone was going to talk about.
Maybe Mike.
But anyway,
I'm getting
way off topic, and I'm not going to digress and say that somebody has texted me to say that Peppa Pig is now sold in 118 territories and worth $2 billion.
Is it really?
That's a side issue.
Okay.
And
Is
we
Peppa
all
Pig
we all
male or
obviously agree
female?
that Mike is what?
Is Peppa Pig male or female?
Peppa Pig is.
Yeah, see, you don't even know, do you? Call yourself culture minister.
Well, my kids are 15 now. Come on, 13 years ago.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
Look, we're not going to. I think we all agree on the Brit point. I mean, the woke debate is very, very interesting because I find myself on the wrong side of it. You know, I was very concerned as a former culture minister when Oliver Dowden, as the culture secretary, started telling museums and galleries what they should do in terms of explaining their collections. I do think that the right has sort of done this tilting at windmill thing where you say if you dare to mention that such and such a historical figure may have had an involvement in slavery, you are denigrating British history. Of course you're not. You're saying that history is extremely complex and nuanced, and also that there are communities in this country that care about this kind of thing and want it explained and brought into the light, and we should be aware of that. So I would regard myself in that particular issue as quite woke. Where I'm probably fall down is, for example, I'm team J.K. Rowling. I think, you know, the news today that she's been targeted by people exposing her home address because of her, I think, correctly held views. Defending women are extremely important. So there are different categories going across this whole debate where people take different opinions.
Steve has come up with I think, quite a good definition of woke. Woke is the eagerness to take offence on someone else's behalf when no offence was meant or taken. That's actually quite profound when you come to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, that is a very good point because that's where the sort of trust breaks down. I think that, you know, and don't get me wrong, there are people on the side of the woke debate who do take things to the nth degree and shouldn't. But I do think that sometimes people pretend, why on earth are you taking offence at this perfectly innocuous statement? Well, it's not innocuous, and people should be called out. And maybe people who, they should be called out. So I think it's often a defensive measure, ironically designed to close down free speech and debate rather than open it up.
Well, I'm going to close down this debate at the moment and go to a break obscenely early because I want to devote quite a lot of time to the next question. It's 8:42.
LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Weekday mornings from 7.
Call the Cabinet Education Secretary, Nadim Zahawi, and in Buntingford.
Anti-vax protesters targeted my granddaughter's school. Can the Education Secretary explain to me what he and his government will do to protect our children?
These incidents are very few. The thing to do is not to play their game.
So you're not going to have exclusions?
Well, because I'd rather have the police deal with it. If they threaten teachers or parents or students, absolutely they should be arrested.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
It's 8:46 on LBC. Time for our next question. Just to remind you, Ed Vaizey, Natasha Devon, Jonathan Reynolds and Ben Habib with me answering your calls. This is a call from Alex in Watford. Alex, hi.
Good evening, Ian. Good evening, panel. What is the panel's view regarding the failure of Brexit? No trade deals, oven-ready deals.
There have been trade deals.
Well, I was going to say the next bit of the question, excluding the views of the host.
That's you, Nobble.
It is, isn't it? Right. I feel that I'm duty-bound to give Ben Habib more time than the other three because he's the only Brexiteer on the panel. At least I assume he still is a Brexiteer. Ed Vaizey.
Oh, I thought you were going to start with Ben. You totally caught me on
No.
Look, well, I'm reluctant to say that Brexit is a failure. There's certainly been some bumps along the road, which we all warned about. I mean, and I think, I'm mindful in this discussion that Ian earlier on said, we don't, because I was obviously listening devotedly to the show from 7 o'clock, said, we don't want to go over all that old ground.
That's because you arrived an hour early.
I know. I'm sad like that. I've got nowhere else to go, Ian, and it's cold outside. But, we don't want to go over old ground. I mean, the trade deals are effectively a rollover of what the EU had, so that's not a massive achievement. And I think the Northern Ireland Protocol is extremely complex and difficult. But having said that, there is some fault on the EU side. I was, in fact, with Nigel Dodds today talking about the protocol, and it is the case that, I have a lot of sympathy with what David Frost says. You could import an oak tree into Northern Ireland the day before Brexit. Why can't you import an oak tree into Northern Ireland the day after Brexit? And that's because the EU has a very legalistic approach, and it's probably this legalistic approach that reduced David Cameron's room for manoeuvre and made Brexit more likely. And it's this legalistic approach which I think is causing problems now. So I think that there is fault on both sides. Look, I think it's depressing that we're not part of members of the European Union. I think there were lots of benefits to individuals in terms of the ability to travel, the ability indeed to retire in southern Spain and avoid those social care costs potentially, and a massive impact on business and trade. And it's certainly the case that there are lots of businesses now that have simply stopped trading with the EU because it is simply too difficult. You can argue that maybe some of that, or a big proportion of that, is the EU's fault, but there we go.
Ben.
Well, obviously this is a subject close to my heart. We haven't actually Brexited yet. The definition of Brexit was for the country to leave the European Union as one United Kingdom. And as Ed has touched on it, we've left Northern Ireland effectively substantially behind in the European Union. And you might be aware, Ian, that together with a few other people, I've taken the government to court over this subject. So we have got a judicial review of the Northern Ireland Protocol going through the appeals court in Northern Ireland at the moment. And the worst aspect, undoubtedly, about the withdrawal agreement was the Northern Ireland Protocol, but every other aspect of the withdrawal agreement was also bad, and the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, I think, was a wretched agreement because it broke, again, the other manifesto promises that the Prime Minister made about Brexit. So, for example, when he said we wouldn't be politically aligned with the European Union, we are actually in a level playing field on a dynamic basis, unable to regress from European Union standards on competition law, employment law, tax matters, state aid, fundamental aspects of governance. We're locked into the European Union. And, the more obvious manifestation of our alignment with the EU is in the fishing rights that they have, all the way down to our 6-mile limit, not just in our economic
until 2025.
No, until 2026 is what they say. But the only deviation allowed after 2026, and you won't hear any government minister saying this, but you can read the document yourself. The only deviation allowed after 2026 is through mutual agreement if there is economic or environmental damage being done by the fishing quotas that exist at that point in time. So we don't have a unilateral right to vary fishing quotas after 2026. If any minister in government tells you that, they're simply lying. We do not have control of our waters. We don't have control of our laws. We don't have control of Northern Ireland. So what we have is a kind of bastardization of Brexit. We haven't really got Brexit. And it's a great shame that it's not real. I mean, it is the Prime Minister's fault in that he did have a majority at the time that he signed the withdrawal agreement. But the debate by the time he got his thumping majority was so poisoned by what had gone on for the last 3 years before that he did find himself between a rock and a hard place. I think it would have been better if he hadn't gone off immediately after the election to Mystique and then actually stayed in the United Kingdom and perhaps try to renegotiate that awful withdrawal agreement. But I genuinely don't think we've got Brexit yet.
Natasha.
I mean, it's difficult listening to you talk, Ben. It's as though you can envision a Brexit where it all went differently. And I'm sure you can, but I can't. I don't see how it could have played out any differently. It seems to me that everything that was warned about by what was then deemed Project Fear has actually come to pass, because we were always going to have less bargaining power than the EU. We're smaller in every sense. So, I mean, from my point of view, it's a very broad question that's been asked by Alex, but in a way, I think COVID has perhaps softened the blow of Brexit, because the economic hardship that is being faced by so many people as a result of it can be blamed on the pandemic.
Johnny.
Yeah, I mean, listening respectfully to Ben, it reminds me a little bit of when you're a Labour MP and you come up against a sort of Trotskyite or revolutionary communist, and they tell you, communism was never really tried in the Soviet Union. If we'll give it one more go, we'll get there. I'll say to Alex, look, Brexit is what it is. It's not an issue where people tend to have changed their minds, if we're being honest. And let's be honest, again, there's a clear majority in the country for it. So this is where we're at. And it's actually, I think, a much more productive conversation to say, how can we improve the various aspects of where we are right now? I know some people say to Labour MPs, well, we should be campaigning to rejoin. But you see, I never think the deal we had would be on offer. I don't think we'd be able to join without joining the euro, which I think actually isn't right for the UK economy. I don't think we'd get things like the rebate and the economics of the budget that we had before, so it's passed. So let's look at solutions that will make things better. In Northern Ireland, we should be looking at trade solutions like a veterinary agreement. I mean, the protocol, for being honest, is working exactly as it was intended. It's strengthening north-south economic cooperation at the expense.
That's not what it was intended to do. There's actually
exactly
provision in the protocol which says that it shouldn't result in a diversion of trade. And indeed, Article 16, which, the big debate that's going on over Article 16, specifically mentions a diversion of trade as being grounds for invoking suspensions.
Respectively, Ben, what you're not accepting is once you leave the customs union, you don't seek an economic agreement that does away with the need for a border. You can put the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, or you can put it between the island of Great Britain and the island of Ireland. And so
the border
were never willing to accept.
The border is already between Northern Ireland. There is a border there, accepted and recognised by the.
There's also a peace agreement which is based on the ability of people to live an Irish identity or a UK identity, and that was always integral to what everybody said. The other things that I would look at, Iain, I think we should have known the sectors that would be disrupted by leaving the single market, whether that's social care or logistics or HGV drivers. The government has quite a lot of money allocated to employment programmes, but they're obviously not doing the trick. If we've got real shortages in those areas, we've got to get more skills and retraining.
The HGV thing, that seems to have gone off the agenda now. Petrol crisis was a sort of 2-week wonder, wasn't it?
But, well, it's still a huge problem in terms of now you're seeing people like ambulance drivers go into HGV driving because the pay is higher. So there is a real need to still focus on the skills and training of that. And there are other things. I mean, I see no reason why we could not have an equivalence agreement for financial services with Europe, where essentially we don't have the same rules, but we respect each other's regulators, and we can do regulated business activities in London or any part of the UK that we should have got as part of the trade deal. So I think there are ways to improve it. But I honestly, similar to it, I don't think fighting the referendum endlessly was a realistic position, and that's why we've got to look at practical ways to make things better.
Where do you think we're going to be in 10 years?
Well, I think, it's going to be the great fault line of British politics, I think. It's a bit like, terrible cliche alert. When Chow En-lai was asked about the French Revolution, we were only just beginning to feel the effects, which I think is actually not a true story. But I think Europe will gradually become the dividing line in British politics, because
between rejoiners,
not rejoiners, but your kind of attitude of cooperation to Europe. When I hear Ben talk about control of our waters, I think in a global world that's a very odd thing. We've got British fishermen fishing in French waters with licenses, and we've got French fishermen fishing in British waters with licences, and this rejection of any kind of European jurisdiction on what are complex trade disputes. I went to Amsterdam the other day. 3 hours door to door from London to centre of London, centre of Amsterdam. I can't do that to go to New York or Brazil or whatever. And these are our neighbours and our friends on whom our security also depends. And we have to have, I think, a much more grown-up attitude. But I think gradually that kind of outlook will begin to see a shift in British politics.
Ben?
Well, I think, just coming back to what you first said, Ed, part of the problem here is the inflexibility and rule-based attitude of the European Union.
Yes, that is definitely.
If the EU had given Cameron just a smidgen of what he'd asked for, rather than sending him back effectively empty-handed, which is what happened, we may not be in this position. And I'm all on for cooperation with the European Union. I'm all on for trading openly with the European Union. But what I don't think is right is that their courts, their unelected, I know this is going to sound like going back to your Trotskyite sort of example, but I don't think it's right that their courts, their unelected bureaucrats are dictating to the British people how we run our affairs. And it seems extraordinary to me, forgive me, Ed and Johnny, for what I'm about to say, but it seems extraordinary to me that British politicians would have such a vote of no confidence in the United Kingdom that they wouldn't wish to take back control completely of the United Kingdom's own destiny.
Well, that's a kind of meaningless challenge. I'm all for us taking control.
I've never really understood that.
One of the reasons I voted Remain was because I thought, as a minister, I seem to have been completely in control of my own destiny, as in what I was able to do as a government minister, as did everyone else, including people like Michael Gove. And, we could build aircraft carriers and we could have alliances with, what does it mean?
But it means that regulations...
somehow if you criticise and say, well, maybe Brexit was a bad idea and this is our largest trading partner next door, you are talking down Britain. I mean, that's just...
No. Let me just give you a slightly different perspective.
I'm making
just a slightly nuanced perspective on that. Yeah. I'm somebody who believes in high labour standards, employment laws, environmental standards. Now, cooperating with other countries against some of the big commercial entities of the world is a way to control our destiny for working people in my constituency. And that cooperation is not trading away power, it's actually giving more power to determine that. And I think that's always been a little bit missing from the analysis. The other thing I think is maybe the bit because when you mentioned the political impact of this, Ed, I mean, it isn't the real other part of this. Ironically, a lot of the areas that ended up very strongly backing the current Prime Minister were places that didn't want the kind of Singaporean low regulation Brexit. They wanted a relatively interventionist state, relatively high spending, and it's changed the coalition fundamentally from the original Brexiteers, who were very kind of, I would say, slightly eccentric right-wing Conservative MPs, into something different. And I'm afraid it's never going to deliver the kind of Brexit you're talking about, because that isn't where the political coalition of the country is anymore.
Interesting discussion, which I played no part in.
Look at it, just started getting going, just as you've only got a minute left of your show.
I know.
That's annoying.
We're going to devote that to Andy in Westminster, who's texted this question. As we saw the funeral of Sir David Amess today in Southend, how do you think he'll be remembered? I'm going to the Westminster Cathedral service tomorrow morning. Natasha?
Well, I can say how I'm going to be honouring his memory. I do a lot of work in schools and I talk to young people about social media, and I speak to them about the importance of stepping outside your silo and following people and interacting with people who don't necessarily share your politics. I could look at David Amess on the surface and we will never agree on abortion or gay marriage. However, dig a little bit deeper, he did so much for people with eating disorders, so much on endometriosis, animal rights, environmental issues, and I think we could have had a really good conversation, more in common than separated, as I think. And he's a perfect example of somebody that you shouldn't dismiss, and probably goes back to the woke discussion we were having earlier, actually.
Okay, Johnny?
He'll be remembered most of all for Southend being a city, which is a truly magnificent achievement, and people will know was his long-running cause. I think he was a true parliamentarian, as Natasha said. I mean, he really was in every aspect of that, and I hope his family, who I think have put out some magnificent statements in what must be a really difficult time, will take some solace from that recognition he's receiving.
Ben?
Well, I had the great good fortune of meeting David in Brussels once and back in Westminster, and he was an extremely kind, gentle, welcoming member of the Conservative Party. So I'm not very popular with the Conservative Party because I used to support the Conservative Party. In fact, I was a donor. But, when I left and joined the Brexit Party, I was kind of persona non grata, probably still am. But he was very, very welcoming, and he entertained me in his office, introduced me to lots of people. So I've got nothing other than good things to say about David Amess. I think he was a superb politician. He was a Brexiteer. He had the best interests of this country at heart, and I imagine that he appealed to many people across the floor.
Okay, Ed?
Well, you knew him a lot better than I did, Ian. But I knew David a bit, and he banged on and on about Southend. I remember when I was the Minister of Culture, we had this contest for the City of Culture in the UK, and he kept saying Southend should be it. And in fact, all the other contestants were complete rubbish, he said. I think that he will be remembered as the epitome of what our politics is fundamentally about, the constituency MP, the person who represented his area with a passion and represented everyone who lived in his constituency regardless of their political persuasion. If we can hold on to that, partly in his honour, then we will just about hold on to civilised debate and progress in this country.
That brings to an end Monday's edition of Cross Question. Johnny Reynolds, Ed Vaizey, Natasha Devon and Ben Habib, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Coming up, we're going to be asking you, what's it like growing up in care? It's 9:02.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, police in the US state of Wisconsin say the suspect who ploughed into a Christmas parade killing 5 people was fleeing a domestic disturbance